was going to return the child to God as Hannah did with Samuel. And so she said to me, perhaps God is coming back to say you got to pay up for making the promise. Well, about a year later, I did something that I always tell people don't do, because I did it out of disobedience. And I said to God, well, if you really want me to do this thing, well, you're going to have to pay for it. So it wasn't really what I did out of obedience. And it was as if God said, is that what you want? You've got it. So my first degree in Nigeria, my first master's degree in the US, my second master's degree in the UK, my PhD in the UK, full ride. So when I do theology with excitement, you now know the story behind it. It's not just for me doing a job, but ministry for me as well.
So when we think of Bible and theology, that's really broad, right? There's a lot of topics, a lot of different sub-disciplines. What kind of was your areas of focus, and what were you drawn to, and why did you kind of go that route?
I've always loved theology, and especially systematic theology. And that's what I pursued at Wheaton College.
And so for a non-theologian, what is systematic theology?
Well, it depends on whether we're in the right mood or not, but it is a form of theology that recognizes the importance of discussing important Christian doctrines and teachings in ways that actually show God's gift of the mind in terms of coherence and logic, but also to do it in ways that, we don't always do that, but in ways that actually take on the needs that we have in the church. That's at least the idea. And depending on where you studied systematic theology, you may end up focusing on the theological guild, right? Study the work of a key theologian. And sometimes systematicians always think they have the answers to all the questions. And so that would be my interest there. But I had an experience, as I finished my time at Wheaton College, I had an opportunity to teach at a seminary in Nigeria during a summer program. In 2001, there was a major theological issue that American evangelicals in the US, especially, were really fascinated about. And it kind of led to a lot of infighting on all the fun stuff. It was pretty much a question about whether God knows the future exhaustively or God knows the future partially. And if you're interested in the fancy terms, open God view or open theism. Clark Pinnock, who was in
just down the road,
was also a part of that conversation in the US. I was fascinated by it. I couldn't wait to introduce that topic in Nigeria. And the assumption, of course, was, well, I've come to the West, I've studied systematic theology, I can go to Nigeria and answer all theological questions, which meant really to tell them the kind of questions they should be asking and to provide the answers to the questions. So after introducing this topic, an elderly pastor who was my dad's friend looked into my eyes in the classroom because he was taking the class, and he called me son, which was culturally acceptable. And he asked me, is it what we sent you there to learn? I mean, I kind of dabbled, trying to figure out inexperience. I had no idea what to do with the question. But that very night, I wanted to quit doing theology because I felt that theology was answering questions that the people who really need it are not asking. That was the background story for my trip to the University of Edinburgh and to study at the Center for World Christianity. So, because of that experience, fast forward, what made me stay back in the field was my recognition that the problem wasn't theology itself, but how I was being taught to do theology. And so I became interested in contextual theology, right, at Edinburgh, and of course in the Center for World Christianity at Edinburgh.
We're definitely going to do contextual theology tonight. It's one of the topics.
Okay.
We're going to do a little bit on this idea of global and world Christianity. But I read something that you wrote. Maybe this can kind of pivot us in some ways into this topic. You wrote about an experience where you heard another African theologian talk about leadership in Africa and said if African leaders didn't have a Christian eschatology of future judgment, then there wouldn't be corrupt. There's something to that effect. Like, do you remember writing that? Maybe it was a long time ago. But just the intersection of how different theologies can affect how local contexts can live out that kind of interpretation. I think the context was because the judgment was postponed and there was forgiveness.
Oh, I remember that now.
Yeah.
I remember that now.
Maybe you could tell the story a little bit better than I did, and then and how that kind of propelled you into some of these questions of.
Well, that's interesting because that was actually it was an article, I believe, that or a chapter in the book that came out of. I was at an AAR conference. I had read a paper, and I think it was that chapter was in honor of a professor at Harvard, Luke Honor. But the general context was, he said, was discussing political issues in Africa and why leaders embezzle money and get away with it. And he said that the problem is that on the day they take their oath of office, that we either give them a Bible or the Holy Quran. And he says that the God of the Christian faith and the God of Islam suspend judgment. But in African indigenous religion, those local deities don't forgive you. If you take an oath, he said, if we want African leaders to stop embezzling the funds that belong to their society, don't give them a Bible or the Holy Quran, take them to a local shrine to take their oath of office. He says they will stop stealing. And so that was the broad context of that, because
I found that story really interesting. I read
the Christian God suspends judgment.
I was like,
and so what I was then asking was, has the Christian faith, at least in the versions that we have in places in sub-Saharan Africa, done more harm than good in terms of how we do theology and take on social realities on the ground? That was the general context of that.
So why don't we kind of go into that topic a little bit? Is that too, maybe, let's go into that topic. So this question of like, kind of the imposition of theological constructs onto cultures, how do cultures interact, and maybe we can define some of the terminology around it, like people talk about syncretism, they talk about appropriation, they talk about kind of hot terms now are colonialization, decolonialization. When we talk about like Christian identity, how does the universal interact with the local particular, and how are these kinds of ideas, how do they kind of impact that kind of identity formation piece?
Well, that's a really broad question.
Sure.
How about I approach it this way? The main issue is, what is the best way to understand the relationship between the Christian faith, especially its gospel, and with all the diverse cultures that the Christian faith encounters? Each time the Christian faith crosses into a new cultural frontier, new questions emerge. And in many cases, theologians wrestle with how best to deal with those questions. In my 2010 book, I talked about, about 4 or so ways that African Christians and Christian theologians have approached this issue. There is a model that that I described in the book as the gap and fulfillment model. And the idea here is that African indigenous religions have some gaps. And the role of the Christian faith is to fill, and some of the theologians that use that approach will invoke the language that we find in the gospel. We have not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And of course, the problem is which version of Christianity is fulfilling what? And what gaps do you have in mind? Who is deciding all of those issues? And whether we can actually make that direct connection between the Jewish traditions and then other cultures of the world. There are some very conservative ones who believed that the African indigenous religions were, quote, cancerous tumors. There is no meeting point between African indigenous religion and the Christian faith. So the best thing is for the Christian faith to destroy African indigenous religion. Now the problem with that, of course, is that in Africa, you don't have a clean division between what is sacred and what is non-sacred. So to do so was to create what Ben Oda in his 1983 PhD dissertation at Princeton said, what happened with those who used this model was the creation of, he called it, religious schizophrenia, right? This double-mindedness. On a Sunday morning, they will be the best Christians. Then the rest of the week, they will be African indigenous. They will go to their cultures, borrow from their own cultures. The destructionism doesn't quite work at all, right? And then you have those who have approached it from the perspective of a reconstruction. Imagine, I see Bishop Stevens show up now, but imagine that we try to renovate this place, and we bring an architect, and it's okay, we want to introduce something new here. The architect will have to choose what to keep and what to take out. So in the Reconstructionist model, some theologians say what we need to do is not simply to go with the idea of fulfillment or destroying everything, but rather to creatively find what are the things in this culture that are really compatible with the Christian faith that we need to keep, and what are the things that are not compatible that we're not going to work with. So those are some of the general ways in which people in Africa have approached this issue. And depending on the model that you use, you're going to have this problem, right? What is the relationship between the Christian faith and the cultures of the world? You know, in my previous institution, one of my favorite classes that I taught was the Christian theologies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. My students always love when I ask them, what is the distinction between the Christian faith, in your view, and what you are seeing, say, in cultures in Africa, Asia, and Latin America? And they're always great at it. You know, oh, this is Christian, and this is not Christian. And then I turn around and ask them, let's talk about the US. What is Christian and what is American? And as some of them look at me, it's almost like, is there a difference, right? If it is Christian, if it's American, isn't it Christian? And of course, with all the interesting new forms of evangelicalism that we have in the US today, it makes it a little bit more interesting too.
I think a concrete example that I read from one of your articles was, like we might say, you know, from scripture that Jesus is the Christ, but an African theologian might say Jesus is the ancestor. You know, and walk us through why this is kind of an important thing to maybe acknowledge as a contribution that couldn't be arrived in a Western context, and how this might actually enhance or enrich kind of a Christian identity or Christian understanding.
Thanks, Steve. One of my areas of interest is called Christology, and you could tell from the term Jesus Christ. I love to talk about Jesus Christ. And there is a passage in the gospel, and I think we have various versions of it. Stephen is here to correct me. But the conversation that took place, Mark tells us, at a place called Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus has asked people, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they gave him different names. I've also wondered, why didn't he stop there after they had given him options? Why did he say, but what about you? Who do you think I am? I always take that to mean that each Christian community has the responsibility of responding to the question of Jesus Christ from the wells of their own faith and cultures and experience. So for the Jewish people, evoking that Jesus is the Messiah would make sense in terms of their history, their prophetic tradition, and all of those. We do know that the Greek-speaking Christians in Antioch perhaps preferred the better term, Lord, which, given how the Jewish people kind of tried to stay away from the divine name, they might kind of try to stay away from Lord, But because each time the gospel enters into a new cultural world, new questions arise, each culture, each Christian community, I think, has the responsibility to respond to that question, drawing from their own context, because that's one of the ways in which they will make sense. There is no response to this question that is perfect. You could have called Jesus the Messiah, but we're going to press you and say, what does that mean? And once you start to respond to that, we can see, oh, well, here are some of the problems with this model. Here are some of the strengths of it. If you call Jesus Lord, we see the same problem. And think about what happened during the exciting period in the 4th and 5th centuries, especially the 5th century during the Christological controversies. Or even what happened at Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea. Today we recite the Nicene Creed, but perhaps many of us don't know how difficult it was to get there, to that actual statement. But for those Greek-speaking people who were really trained and almost impacted by, say, Hellenistic Greek metaphysics, to say that Jesus Christ had the same nature as God the Father, and they used the word homoousios, it was important to them to think in such category to explain the relationship between Jesus Christ and God the Father. If you read the Ode of Solomon and its formation of the Trinity, it might terrify us if we are not familiar with it, right? Especially if you think about the Trinity in prose, precise language. But the Ode of Solomon described the Trinity with metaphors of milk, and God the Father milking it, and Jesus the one who is being milked, all of that, the poetic way of doing theology. For Africans, though, the metaphor of ancestor has become very prominent. I mean, if you're familiar with some of my writings, I'm kind of very critical of it, but I love that it is a way for a lot of African Christians to remind their fellow Christians that the Christian faith is not a foreign faith, that it can become their own faith as well. And if you're familiar with African indigenous cosmology, so the ancestors, sometimes called the living dead, have this important role between the spirit and human world. So they function almost like mediators between the spirit world and the human world. So for some theologians, to describe Jesus as the ancestor or ancestor par excellence, right? He is the one who fulfills this task. He is the one that can lead you to this God. You don't have to depend on your earthly elders. So it's a very familiar model. I'm quite critical of it, though, not usually for what people think, because my argument is that Jesus would not have qualified as an ancestor if he was accused of the same crime of violating the traditions of the society. Because in Africa, for you to become an ancestor, you must pass those, But if he was, for example, challenging the authority and he was accused of, we might disagree on how those readings are. But if an African society judged him to be a violator of the tradition, he would not qualify as an ancestor. So, but there are, of course, every model has its own strength and weakness.
So maybe to push back a little bit, like when Paul warns the Galatians that, even if an angel preaches another Christ than I've preached to you, what's the limits of taking on your own interpretation, your own Christological interpretations? Like, what are the guardrails if we're going to contextualize in every context?
I'll come back to that question in a minute, but it's good that I'm glad that you actually invoked that. The issue in Galatia was partly about circumcision, right? Do you need to be circumcised? And if we go back to the story in Acts 15 too, it was the same issue that led the council at Jerusalem to say, no, we don't need to require people to become proselytes in order for them to benefit fully from the Christian faith. So what was actually driving that partly was to recognize that it's almost like the translatability of the Christian faith, because the decision to rule against those Judaizers who required people to be circumcised in order to benefit became a watershed moment. It doesn't, of course, mean, so we have to deal with this issue of the translatability of the Christian faith, but we also need to deal with the issue of the integrity of the faith as well. We may ask, how do we decide what to keep and what not to keep? It's a very important question, and I think it is also important to ask, who is the one deciding? So you have to deal with the issue of power as well. Don't tell my fellow theologians that I've said this, but I don't think that the core of what should be non-negotiable should be a theological issue or a theological belief. I think, in my words, because I'm deeply Christocentric, that it has to be the recognition of what the scripture tells us about Jesus of Nazareth. So Jesus himself is this. And of course, we know as we read the Gospel, we see the different representations of him. So rather than a particular theological statement they're important. Creedal statements are really, really important. But we also need to recognize that they can be revised as well, if necessary.
So you're telling me that, German theologians don't have a monopoly on what's right and wrong? Is that what?
Well, I hope not. I hope not, because we've gotten it wrong quite a few times, isn't it? One of the things that I've come to appreciate as a theologian is to recognize the finitude of human mind, and when we're dealing with the mystery of God and the mystery of Christ. So, and this is why I believe that we do need a set of eyes of all of these Christian communities around the world to begin to appreciate fully what Paul talks about as the depth and the width and the breadth of the love of Christ. And of course, as we do this, we have to, of course, mutually critique each other. There are people who learn from each other as we iron these things out in the process.
Yeah, maybe getting back to the statement you made about power. So kind of theological understanding has been shaped largely through certain structures, especially in education. How do you begin to kind of broaden kind of perspectives on that within the kind of maintaining the integrity of the faith that you talked about? But maybe analogous to that in some ways is, the proliferation of things like YouTube and the internet, where certain figures can have larger voices than maybe they need, or they become very influential, and they actually shape globally now, how people understand the Christian faith. Like, how do we kind of navigate, both the historic structures that kind of drive certain understandings and kind of like this contemporary reality of the popular preacher that now has a global platform and can kind of influence, many millions or maybe even billions, of people, through these mediums.
Well, I was gonna discern three different questions there, but start from the last comment you made. I hope that a place like here, like Wycliffe, theological institutions, universities, where people are trained, will continue to play an important role, especially in our age where popularism is really, so if whoever has the megaphone can say whatever they want to say and have a lot of followers. So I hope that the places like here will continue to be faithful to the mission of training and educating Christian leaders who are going to serve in different places. That's, for me, one of the ways that we can at least try to. It doesn't mean, of course, that we are not going to listen to whoever is on YouTube or a popular version of Christianity. I think, in fact, if anything, hopefully we can bring such people into dialogue, if it is possible. And because sometimes those are the people, and this is, part of it is, academic theology sometimes focuses on peer-driven questions. What are we doing? What are we presenting in conferences and all of those? We ignore what is happening at the grassroots. And some of those people you're describing really tap into those issues at the grassroots. And in fact, one of the current books I'm working on now, the last chapter is dealing with the relationship between grassroots theologies and academic theology. And I'm exploring, it's been fascinating to ask the question, what is it that these grassroots theologies, by grassroots I mean the theologies that are produced by people who do not have fancy theological education, and sometimes you'll find them in songs, in prayers, in sermons, and all of those. And what can they contribute to academic theology? And of course, what can academic theology contribute to the process? So I'm trying to bring those two into dialogic communication. So I hope that a place like Wycliffe will find a creative pathway to and make a space for such people to actually to be in dialogue with such things. On the issue of power, one of the things that I've come to appreciate as a scholar of world Christianity is, maybe if I'm in a bad mood, I can describe it a little bit more forcefully, but is this recognition that the Western versions of Christianity do not constitute the normative Christianity. So in other words, you don't have to become a Westerner to become truly Christian. And this was always the problem with the Christendom mindset that really played a significant role in European advancement of the Christian faith around the world. Why on earth would someone like me, who grew up in Nigeria, have the name Victor? Well, of course, the name I took on the day I got baptized. It's the Christian name. I mean, it's not unusual for you to have people in my own age and older, and perhaps even younger, have an English name, and then a local name, or a French name and a local name. Does that remind us of the colonial relations, and sometimes the version of Christianity that the missionaries who had the zeal to do the work, but perhaps they didn't take any course in cultural anthropology, and looked at all the cultures as terrible. Well, if you don't understand it, it's demonic. And if you are truly a Christian, you got to show a clean break. Your names are connected to all these demonic words, so you got to take a new name. And usually, it will be something in the name of in the language of the missionary, the mother tongue of the missionary, or from the Bible, if you're being a little bit more creative. So we need to recognize, and in the field of world Christianity, there is an opposite error that we also need to counter. Sometimes when people use the phrase world Christianity, what they have in mind is Christianity somewhere else. Like if you go to a supermarket and you have a section that is called the world food. So it will be something out there. And you also find in academic settings where some people have described world Christianity as Christianity in the non-Western world, as if what is happening here is not part of that. And these are some of the misconceptions of world Christianity. But I think the reason why people have gone that route is, first, they want to push against this idea that Western Christianity is the normative Christianity. And also to push against the idea that all of the Christian communities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the Oceania, and other parts of the world are simply the derivatives of Western Christianity, something in the periphery. So people are trying to forcefully push against that. So that's part of this power dynamics.
Well, let's go to the theme of our talk, or what we titled the night on, the problem with the term global Christianity. Let's kind of unpack that and unpack what you're kind of talking a little bit more about this idea of world Christianity as a sort of pejorative in some ways, of derivative forms of the Christian faith. What may a Western person be unaware of when they use a word like global Christianity?
Well, this might be a good time to kind of get it out of the way that I prefer the term world Christianity to global Christianity. And the reason, of course, and I use both terms interchangeably. There are some of my colleagues who don't, like Lamin Sane, the Gambian. He used global Christianity specifically for what he understood as the replications of Western forms of Christianity abroad, and usually by means of the colonial crusading spirit of the Christendom. That's what he called global Christianity. World Christianity, he believed, will be the indigenous, variegated manifestations of the Christian faith, some of which that arose partly as a rejection of Western Christendom model, and also the forms of Christianity that have really used indigenous agencies, and many times without recourse to Western tradition. I think we can keep what he's describing as global Christianity. I think Christendom does it well, so I can keep that without trying to conflate the two ideas. But Steve, world Christianity has somehow become a buzzword, right? So it depends on who is using it and how people are using it. There are a lot of misconceptions of what world Christianity really is. If I can just briefly just kind of highlight a few.
You're the expert. I'm just asking questions.
So some of them are quite obvious. A misconception could be that when we use the phrase world Christianity, we are saying that suddenly Christianity has become multicultural. So it's something that it has acquired. It's not it is not in its DNA. Well, that's not quite true, because from an astonishingly early period, the Christian faith was bicultural in some sense. The Greek and the Jewish cultures and what sometimes the New Testament writers lump together as the Gentile cultures. So at least in some sense, it was bicultural. And we know, think about what happened at the Pentecost, as people came from different traditions. And some of the Western missionaries in the 16th century who arrived in India discovered that the Christianity has always been there. Some trace it back to St. Thomas, so the Farmer Church, the St. Thomas Church. And they tried to form them in their own image. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of how some of these Catholic bishops wanted to compel the farmer churches to replace the apostolic figure that they have appreciated. So replace St. Thomas with St. Peter. And by the way, you don't have to do your theology in Syriac. You can do it in Latin, and liturgy in Latin. Maybe we make Rome the center of attraction, not Edessa and all of those issues. And it never went well, right? Because it led to these two versions of Marthoma churches up to today. So that's one example. Christianity has always been, at least in principle, diverse. So it's not something that it just became. Another misconception is what I've already talked about. Christianity is somewhere else. It's not us, it's them. And the other, which is connected to this idea of Christianity somewhere else, is that with some people, and this is part of the old missions model, that when they wrote about the history of Christian missions, they in some ways projected this idea that when you have Christian communities outside of Europe and North America, that they are simply the foreign outposts of the Christianity back home. So that's another misconception of the term. And some also use the term to describe the indigenous manifestations of the Christian faith. If you're familiar with African indigenous churches, AIC churches, some of them, I mean, going back to the early 17th century, there was a Congolese woman known as Vida Kimper, who looked at the versions of Roman Catholicism that the Protestant missionaries brought to the Congos and said, no, this cannot be reconciled with the Christian faith. In fact, Jesus cannot be white because he cannot be an oppressor like you guys. Jesus was black. And of course, what happened was that she was burnt at stake as a heretic. But she was playing around with what didn't quite survive as the Antonian model. Her apostle was St. Anthony of Egypt, the monastic, which the Coptic Christians really cherish. So the indigenous agencies, but it's not just that. It is part of it. It cannot be the sum total of that. Another one is to think of world Christianity as the local expressions of the Christian faith. So in Canada, you could have a particular version of the Anglican Church. That's our own model. That's different. It was in Canada that I've learned that you have to be very careful when you use the language Anglican. You have to specify whether it is evangelical or not. So I've been kind of trying to learn about all of these local different expressions of the faith. And the other is to think of global Christianity as simply what Christian communities around the world share in common. The agenda here is to try to rediscover the unity that ought to characterize the Christian faith among all of this diversity. All of these, I think, are not really good expressions. They don't quite capture at least the phenomenon. It is helpful, at least in the way I approach it, to make a distinction between the phenomenon that we're calling world Christianity and the field of study that actually explores the phenomenon. And as we think about the phenomenon, it's always important, at least in the way I approach it, to think about what we might call the animating core of it, and then all of the paradigm shifts that have taken place. An example of the paradigm shift is that we do know that in 1910, the typical Christian will look like a European. In our world, it's an African or Latin American. Sometimes we call this the demographic shift from the so-called Western to the non-Western world. Another paradigm shift is that a lot of theologians who are writing outside of Europe and North America have now shared this idea that for you to be recognized as a good theologian, you must study Karl Barth or Karl Rahner or any other Karl that you want to study. All right, sorry, but they're recognizing We can have dialogue with all of these Christian theologians around the world, but they don't have to decide for us what is authentic and what is not authentic. Because theology is always at its best when it is done to take on the questions that people are asking in their own community. The questions that people in Canada today are asking may not be relevant to the questions that Christians in India are asking today. And we have to recognize that. And we don't want to make the mistake of trying to superimpose a particular theology that has been developed in this part of the world and force it on people outside of it, because it's not going to work. And in many of these cultures, they can respect you. As a good African, I may disagree with you, but I will probably try to be respectful, not to show it. Unless I bring back my British training, then I can say to you and still expect that we can go have coffee later afterwards. But so that would be some examples of this shift. But what about the animating core? And that's always what is crucial. I think it is what I have described as communal Jesus devotion, in its variegated manifestations and developmental trajectories as well. By Jesus devotion, communal Jesus devotion, I mean people who participate in devoting to Christ. And we know this will vary from place to place, from culture to culture. People devote to Christ for different reasons. And sometimes they do that in community. And you also see in some of these devotion, as they dialogue with the person of Christ, they also reveal something about their own culture, about their own experience, about their own struggles, about the questions that they address to Christ. One example will be, I remember when I was doing my doctoral research, I decided to do what systematic theologians don't normally do, which is to do ethnographic research. Because we are good at, doing library literature review. So. It was liberating for me. I remember a particular conversation that I had with a Presbyterian deaconess. I had asked her a very straightforward question: who is Jesus to you? And then she started to describe her in different ways. This is who he is because my son was sick. We went to the hospitals. Nobody could do anything about it. We prayed to Jesus, and Jesus healed him. And I was waiting for her to come around to say that Jesus is the Son of God and fully human. She never said it. And then I volunteered it. And she looked at me and said, but that's a given. You should know that, right? Think about it for a moment. That deaconess expanded my Christological horizons from the normal thing that I would have tried to do, just focus on how is it possible for a human being to be fully God. But in that word, part of what she was wrestling with, and again, this is why I say these expressions tell us more about the struggles of different communities. If you did any Christology, any work on Christ, that you hope to be relevant to African Christians, let's say narrowly, sub-Saharan African Christians, and you do not directly engage the relationship between the spirit world and the human world, that Christology is not going to be relevant at all, because that's the way they think, right? It's not in this part of the world. We have to recognize that. And I think, by the way, that's one of the things that it's not unique to Africa. I see that in Asia. I see that in parts of Latin America, that's what they can contribute to the Western world. I've always told this story a few times, but in my previous university, I was giving a lecture on St. Anthony in the early church, and they had read St. Athanasius' life of St. Anthony. And I asked my student, it was a large class of about over 120, so it was a very large class. I asked them what they thought about the reading. And one of the students who was at the back row shouted from there something like, he was dehydrated. He was dehydrated. So St. Anthony was talking about demons and fighting the demons because he needed something. And that's, of course, typical, right? He couldn't quite try to connect the spirit world and the human world in a post-enlightenment. Try that in Africa. It's not going to work, right? You do need to find Jesus must be relevant. You must show how he is able to engage those words and usually to defeat those powers. You've been in Gambia a few times, so as when you encounter some of these issues as well.
Yeah, I lived there for 3 years. I remember watching a movie once, and like these spirit things were coming out of the tree and coming out of water, and I was like, oh, that's like super interesting. And they people I was watching with were like, oh, that's just normal, and I was like, okay, but yeah, it's just understanding like different cultures have these very, very different worldviews and cosmologies, and we definitely see it through these different lenses. I think what we want to do is open up for some Q&A from the audience. And so, do we have a microphone or no microphone? We'll check. But we can have a loud person ask the first question until we find out if we have a microphone or not. But thanks for painting this kind of landscape of kind of some of the contours of this this topic. So maybe I'll start off if nobody has a question. Like in my time in Gambia, I remember going into this Methodist church, and it had an organ, and it was almost like a time capsule of 1860 Methodism, but in Gambia, in Africa. In Africa, it was all Africans there worshiping. And then the week after, I went to a Pentecostal church. It was very vibrant and lively. And I remember thinking, I was like, which one is African Christianity? And like, obviously both were kind of brought, from different perspectives. They both interact with the culture differently and in different ways. Maybe you can help me kind of process through, some very different experiences, of, and like when I say like 1860 time capsule, it was like it kind of felt like it was built then, and you're transported back in time. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's very important. When we use the expression African Christianity, sometimes we forget that there is no single form of this Christianity in Africa. It's also what we do when we use the term Bible, right? Sometimes we forget that it is a collection of writings written from at different periods in different genres. It's almost like a library, right? Divinely inspired, obviously. But the term African Christianity, when I use it, I hope that at least, let me paint a picture of the different strands of Christianity in Africa. There are the earliest versions who trace their origins back to one of the apostles, the Orthodox churches. For example, the Coptic Orthodox or the Ethiopian Orthodox, they would trace all of their origins back there. Now, the interesting thing is that those churches didn't quite cross the Sahara Desert to go down to the sub-Saharan African area. We had to wait for the explorers and slave traders to show up and the missionaries to bring the gospel there. So you have that particular strand. You also have what we call the Western mission-founded churches. Those would be the Roman Catholic, Anglican Church, or the tradition that I grew up in called ECWA. It was founded by 2 missionaries from Canada and 1 missionary from the US. So they were part of the old SIM, the formerly Sudan Interior Missions, but it's now changed their name. And then, so you have the Western founded churches. You also have the African founded churches as well. I have to be very careful with this because when we talk about those Western missionary founded churches, take for instance the Anglican Church of Nigeria. If you're familiar with the story of what happened in Sierra Leone, the Niger mission expedition, the first time the Western missionaries tried it, it didn't work, but when people like Samuel Ajayi Crowther got involved, it worked. Now that, of course, that story, sometimes when I think about it, it brings me, forgive me all the Anglican people. So I'm not an Anglican, so you got to be generous with me here. But I don't know if you know the story. One of the things that Samuel Ajay wanted to do was to implement Henry Venn's idea of a native church that was self-propagating, and also a native church that was self-supporting, and a native church that also can lead itself. So he really invested all of his time developing local leaders. Fast forward, there was a particular person serving under his leadership who, something happened in his house. I think a maid also in the process died. The Church Missionary Society sent, I believe, a young Cambridge scholar to go examine the case, and then returned with a report, which Samuel Ajay Crowther didn't see until it was published in London. And the idea was that Africans were not qualified to lead themselves. And it took a very long time before we will have an African as the bishop of the Niger. Samuel Ajay Crowther saw everything he worked for disappear in his presence. And again, you see some of this complex. So when I say the mission-founded churches, of course, the churches that were founded by missionaries from this part of the world, we also need to remember the complexities of these stories. And as a result of that event, for example, there were churches who said, you know what, we are going to leave the church. We are not going to try to reform the church from within the Anglican Church. We're going to start parallel churches. And that is called part of the history for the African indigenous churches movement. So those are the different versions. The Western missionaries will always look at the AIC churches and call them African independent churches. And of course, when they use the term independent, what they wanted to show is that these people don't belong to the church. You know, they're heretics. They have almost left the church. They can't be part of the real church. They are the mission stations too, or mission field too. And that is why in literature today, people like me prefer the term indigenous rather than independent. Although when African theologians and historians use the term independent, they want to connect what was happening during this period to also what will during the independence movements in the 60s as well. So those are the different versions of the churches. So the example that you gave, you have to almost trace which church, which missionaries brought it, what versions. I mean, in my own the church that I grew up in, anytime I want to cause trouble, I will ask them to do the Eucharist with the locally made palm wine. He's there, would you do that in the Anglican Church? And other people think you're a heretic. Why do we have to use a foreign wine to do Holy Communion in our own society?
Palm wine's not that good.
You're sure? Why do you think so? I mean, it's my culture. Why can't I use it? I don't drink. So
I don't drink anything anyway.
So that's fine.
All wine is not good to me, but anyways.
But again, this language of some of these churches have still retained the control. And we have to recognize the sacrifices that they have made. We must recognize that. And we also need to recognize that it is not true that that Western missions had unambiguous relationship with the colonial powers. That's not historically accurate at all. So we need to recognize that as well. Yet, many of these churches, because they wanted to do, the seminaries, think about some of the seminaries that we have in places like Nigeria, in other parts of the world. Take a look at their own curriculum. It would look like what you will get here. In the seminary that I got the only degree I got from Nigeria, the person who taught African theology, I think they call it contemporary African theology, he taught it as a bad thing. And that was what I grew up with. And even though as an undergraduate, I was a rebel, because I remember saying There's all of these heroes who didn't see anything good about Africa couldn't possibly be a model for me for how to theologize in the first place. All right, open it up.
All right, questions, go ahead. Oh, we got a mic.
Okay. I'd like to use an example and then I think just let you comment on it. And I'm mindful of sensitivities around it, but there was a time where the African church, I know I'm trying to be a good listener as well, but the conversation around sexuality was coming up. So this, I think I have a question that's both about like orthodoxy and theology, but then it's also about this idea of global and or world Christianity. But a lot of the progressives in predominantly America who had an opinion on what the church should be responding to sexuality came out very strong and dominant and critiqued the African church, so to speak, and said, like, you don't know what you're talking about. And so then a lot of the bishops or leaders kind of said, we don't need you to tell us how to exist in the world with our faith. So for me as a listener, like as someone who's just like, I'm growing up in this, I've worked in secular higher education for 22 years. I am a follower of Jesus, but there's these kind of convergent points of colonization, decolonization, and then there's this idea of cultures and what we've been talking about tonight, and then there's orthodoxy and faith. And so I bring that example up because as a watcher, I was like, I don't even know how to engage in this conversation because someone's going to yell at me from some angle. So I would just love your thoughts on this. And may I just also say how encouraged I am that with all your accolades, there's just such I sense your love for the Trinity so deeply. And so as I've listened, I've just been so encouraged. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I will come back to the issue of sexuality because I think, we know it is of such a sensitive issue that has created a lot of divisions, not just in this part of the world, but also across the globe. I'll come back to it in a minute. But I want to share a cultural shock, right? And this was in 2001, the whole issue of open God view and does God know the future exhaustively or not? One of the things that shocked me was how that divided the church to a point that people couldn't really want to have conversation. It actually traumatized me and it made me not to become a member of the ETS because people were being kicked out of the Evangelical Theological Society, and I was wondering, well, we share the same Bible. We are doing our best to interpret it to the best of our knowledge. We're going to get it wrong sometimes. Why can't we create a space where we can actually dialogue, mutually critique each other, rather than trying to kick everybody out? One of the reasons Christianity, Coptic Christianity, really declined when the people from the Arabian Peninsula came into Egypt. Remember, Egypt was really a center of Christianity. Most of the theologies that we now talk about as Western theology were really cooked in an African pot, right? Because they were the issues that were developed there. If you're familiar with the decision of the Council of the Chalcedonian definition, right? And the way that the church enforced this orthodox view. A lot of Christians in Egypt who were Coptic chose to go with Cyril of Alexandria, who said that Jesus Christ had one incarnate nature. You can't talk about two natures after the incarnation. But the Melkites, of course, part of their work of enforcing this was to make sure that we have purity of doctrine, which meant, of course, people, you could be physically assaulted for holding a particular view. And historically, see, when some of these Coptic Christians who were being persecuted saw the Muslim community from the Arabian Peninsula show up, they actually praised God for bringing the Muslims to rescue them from the hands of their own fellow Christians. So in the pursuit of the purity of doctrine, I think it is always important to ask, are we doing more harm than good? Should we pursue it? Absolutely. But we also need to recognize the unity of the church within the context of diversity. I will approach this issue of which has caused so much problem around the world by saying, I would love to see communities that model a place where people who hold different views of this can actually dialogue and can support each other rather than looking for ways to kick people out and trying to keep people in. I mean, it has never always worked historically for us. I mean, think about the Donatists and during the persecution as well. So it has not gone well for us. So it's fascinating too that as I studied this issue of sexuality and the ways that African Christians are being invoked and brought into the conversation, and some churches in the U.S. trying to leave their churches and identify with a church in Nigeria or other parts of the world. And I gotta say, that's exciting, at least, if they can recognize them as an important voice. But on a serious note, I do hope that I always ask myself, is this particular issue worth destroying the unity of the church? It's always one I always come back to that. As a theologian, I love to talk about precision. I like to talk about purity of doctrine. I think it is absolutely important. But I always come back to ask, is it worth all of the rancor and division and sometimes hatred? I had a very good friend, a lawyer, who the denomination had a gender-related issue. They chose to go a different path, and the denomination said to them, you know what, we are going to take the church that these local communities paid for. And the local community said, no, we are going to keep the church. You can take your name, but we're going to keep the building, the actual physical building. And of course, he went all the way to all the courts. And I've always asked myself, anytime I had conversation with him, and I say, what testimony, really, are we... you have similar thing in Nigeria, like my denomination, who are the people at the top help along with the local church, and the issue went to the Supreme Court, and those judges there were all Muslims, judging, making decisions. And I think some of them said, wow, don't you think that, can't you Christians actually settle this problem? Why do you have to bring this up here? I'm not saying that there's no place for that, but I hope that perhaps we need to return to some of the principles that we can discern in the New Testament of really dialogic conversation. Is there a place to correct faulty theologies? Yes, we have that. I think there are models. How we go about doing it, I think it's absolutely important. And there are some Christians too who think that they have downloaded the mind of God on a pen drive. They are the ones who know everything about God. There is no sense of humility. I think it's also important for all of us and all our communities to recognize that there is at least 1% chance that we might not have it all right. And therefore, it is important to always learn, be willing to dialogue, even especially those whose views we disagree with. Sorry, I'm trying to paint a broader picture, but I wanted to kind of deal with this on. Does that help at all, rather than commenting specifically on? Yeah. And I will assume that if in a place like Wycliffe, you're going to have people on different trajectories. And,
so that one's hard, but give us an easy one. What's something we can hate? What's a black and white issue?
A black and white issue.
Yeah.
Do we have such things?
I don't know. Give us some hope. Like if we're really.
All right. Okay. So here is this one. If someone comes to me and says, Victor, I am a Christian. I love Christian communities, but I don't accept the authority of the Bible. I will have a problem with that. I will still go out and have coffee with you. It is not, though, it's not going to mean that I'm not going to have fellowship with you. I think also, and this is my problem with this communication, because I think that if a church communicates a sinning brother, if that church abandons that sinning brother or sister or brethren, that church has actually failed in its basic job. Because it's not just about kicking out, it's about working hard, praying and discerning to find ways to bring them back into fellowship. We might not succeed, but we can't give up on pursuing to bring them. So there are things. Another one, because I love Christology, I always get into trouble with this one.
We'll develop Victor's list so that you can have it in your pocket and you can check to see if this is
If someone says to me that I believe that Jesus Christ is divine only in a functional sense, in other words, he's simply an agent that God has used to accomplish something great, I would say, well, I'm a traditionalist. I believe that, it's functionally, but he's also ontologically divine. Is he, So some of those, and I think because this is also central to the whole issue of our salvation and other complex issues there. So, but are there black and white, right and wrong theological issues? Absolutely right. The question is, what do we do next? That's what I'm trying to press here, right?
Yeah, it's not only about the doctrine itself, it's how we approach. And are we constructive? Are we hoping for restoration and redemption?
Yes.
As opposed to kind of ostracization and alienation.
And the name calling. And I was reading, rereading the Nicene Creed, and the synodal letter that the council wrote, with all the curses,
the anathemas.
The anathemas.
Yeah,
and
we need to bring back some.
So I'm doing this. I'm working on this for an article, and what caught my attention as I read that letter was how the letter, kind of listed or called areas, all these impious person and impious doctrine, and then used the word sin. And I was asked, last night, I didn't go to bed until 2 a.m. I was trying to figure out what is the connection between a bad theology and being a sinner. And of course, perhaps they have to justify the anathemas, right? And the idea, and I will assume that for these councils, they had power to place Arius and his followers, Eusebius and Caesarea and Nicodemus, all of those guys, on the judgment. And because the council believed he was also representing God, that they were also acting on God's behalf to place them under eternal condemnation as well. By invoking that word, sin, think about it. When we talk about a wrong theology and sin, of course, it could be the gravity of, is he fully God or not fully God, all of those. But I think it is fascinating to see how we can make those connections.
All right, another question here is next. Yeah.
Hi, Victor. Thank you so much for sharing. Really appreciate it. I loved your points about contextualizing Christ using the language of a particular group of people. You talked about how the language of a Messiah is such a Judaic way of talking about Christ. The language of a Kyrios, like the Lord, is so Greek. And my question is, you know, when I think about this way of contextualizing Christ, it sort of ties Christ to the local myth of a particular group of people, right? Christ as something very intimate and very familiar. To a medieval Christian, it was, a feudal lord. To an Enlightenment Christian, it was a rational watchmaker. But who's Christ to the Western world today? I think, I'm trying to latch on to some Western myth that is alive to us and that is like something vibrant that we can like tie Christ into. But I mean, the language of a Messiah, or the language of a king, is as foreign to us as it is to anybody else living in the world today. And for all the theological education, I don't know if we came any closer to understanding what it means to be a Messiah in a way that, the Jews of that time would. So what is the Western myth where we can contextualize Christ?
I think you might be in a better position to answer that than me, but I would love to see someone, or maybe you construct something that is connected to, say, the idea of free market economy. Sorry, am I getting into trouble? But
You're saying Jesus was a capitalist? You heard it here first.
I didn't say that. It's my way of critiquing that, isn't it?
Okay.
But because now I want to come back to this. Remember, every single metaphor will have its own limitation. That's the basic point. And this is why I believe it is always important, and what Christianity does this, because it promotes this idea of trans-cultural engagement. Because I can look at a particular metaphor that invokes that represents something, say, in contemporary Canada. When you hear what I say about Christ, based on contemporary issue in Nigeria, for example, we can see the blind spots that each one has. So no single metaphor, even the one of Messiah too, right, has its own limitations as well. So there is no perfect metaphor. I mean, Peter was a good example, right? Who do you say the Son of Man is? Well, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus even said that flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but God. But when Peter called Jesus the Messiah, what exactly did Peter have in mind? Think about that as Jesus started to talk about his death on the cross, and Peter rebuked him. If you are the true Messiah, you don't die. You kick out God's enemies. And Jesus, I'm assuming, accused Peter of propounding his devilish theology, right? Get behind me, Satan. My point is that every single metaphor that we use will have its own limitations. And one of the ways that we can actually help each other out is when we bring all of these into dialogue. So coming back to the issue of the West. So on a more serious note, I think it depends on what West do you have in mind. Let's even narrow it down to Canada, and we're going to ask the same question. What part of Canadian communities do you have in mind? Would it be, say, the migrant community? Jesus, who is this figure who is a wanderer? That might actually make sense as we think about Jesus taking a flight to Egypt as a refugee. That could be. What about the indigenous community? I am also learning, I have so much to learn about the Canadian culture, that when you talk about the indigenous community in the north, it might be slightly different when you go different where else. I think one of the ways that we can do this is actually to train ourselves, especially those of us in the academia, to train ourselves to try to discern at the grassroots levels the images that emerge in the daily struggles of people who do not have formal theological education that we serve in our churches. So it will be, which West do you have in mind? And the term West, we know how broad it is. Do we mean Western Europe? Or do we, but I am, as a contextual theologian, I always want to draw closer and closer to local communities. There is someone who wrote, I don't know if you read the book, I think he called Jesus a Cowboy, Jesus and the Cowboy.
Jesus and John Wayne.
John Wayne, okay, so, well, I can let you think about that.
Christian Dumas.
And just see if it actually works. But there also are indigenous Christian theologians who have also developed different images as well. So what I'm saying is that I think we do need to discern, not in this broad category of the West, but to come closer to our own local communities and see what images can we discern, bearing in mind that it cannot be perfect. It's not going to be perfect. None is without its own limitations as well.
Do you know what's cool about Canada? We value multiculturalism.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay. So is it in the sense of having silos or intercultural?
No, I think it's like allowing cultural expressions of each. That's what we say, anyways. But sometimes we don't practice it well. But maybe there's an opportunity for a multicultural
Experience?
Jesus, a Canadian Jesus that's multicultural.
You know, someone took me last Friday to, I think it's called The Well.
Oh yeah.
It's like a mall,
Yeah.
and they have a food court. Oh, I mean, I was there and I saw all of these cultures in the same place, and I was thinking, wow, when I teach my course on intercultural theology in the fall of next year, I'm going to take my students there.
That's a good idea. I might take
just
the class.
to see it, to think about. It is fascinating stuff, you know. And the person also said that they are not. None of these restaurants, we didn't test all of them, but are not trying to cook their meals to kind of suit the Canadian style. They're trying to preserve their own culture. And so, I don't know. I mean, I had a really nice meal there. So I thought it was fast. It's amazing that we went there to eat, but you know, it kind of struck me that this might be a good place to bring students to talk about intercultural engagement. Yeah.
All right. Next question.
There's
Here.
someone there.
What? I guess I can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. I feel like your alma mater only produces scholars of Baving and or Christianity. Sorry, Edinburgh.
Oh, that.
But so, from I'm more thinking about methodologically speaking. Someone says war Christianity is a field rather than a discipline.
Say it one more time.
War Christianity is a field rather than a discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking, as someone who's not a theologian, and it feels like theologians always have the good judgment of all the other disciplines, and practitioners of all the other disciplines. So in today's field of war Christianity, what would be the need of contribution from the other persons and practitioners of other disciplines of theology could do in order to contribute to this field of war Christianity from a theologian's perspective?
You know, I actually think that, I mean, there's this whole debate going on, what is the best approach to tackle the subject matter in the field. I think the best option we've got is to have an interdisciplinary approach to this. My mentors, did you meet Andrew Walls? Okay, so, I mean, he's not a theologian in the sense of he was a historian of Christianity, although he also dabbled on historical theology. So you have, I think in our field, right, so you have historians, missiologists have really played, their voices are always heard. Theologians are kind of trying to get on board. And then you have people in diasporic studies, so gender. In my class yesterday, on Wednesday, we're talking about methodology and interdisciplinary approach, and some of the unique contributions that people in the social sciences can. So I think the best way that the field can really, really flourish is when we develop the mindset of adopting an interdisciplinary approach to the study. Because each of these disciplines I mean, because think about the reality we're dealing with here. You can approach, imagine that a theologian decides to study Dalit Christianity in Kerala, India. If the theologian does not really understand the field of religious studies, the theologian might not actually understand the complexity of the Hindu relations and the culture. Sometimes even you need the work of anthropologists. I remember when I was writing The Art of Contextual Theology, I was reading the works of sociologists and anthropologists who were dealing with caste system in India to even fully make sense of what I'm trying to deal with. So I think it got, at least this is my take on it got to be interdisciplinary. As a theologian, I think though, that whatever field you want to do, you do need contextual theology there. And the reason why I say this is if we are interested, if a very essential component of this phenomenon is the variegated, diverse, cultural manifestations of this faith across culture, we do need theologians who are trained to discern, to engage those theological questions that these communities are generating, either vocally or non-verbally. And systematic theology is not going to help you with that. I mean, I tried it, it didn't work, right? So that's why I kind of try to move in a different direction. So what field? What is your field?
I mean, just history.
So history, and historians have kind of, I think that I was told was that historians have dominated the field, right? Right. But, well, he will always laugh and say, Victor, maybe missiologists as well. Theologians, I mean, we are, Peter Fan, right? He's been trying to complain that theology is far behind in this field. And I think he's right? Because it messes theologians up. Especially if you are a trained systematician, you want something that is clean and tidy and precise, and what Christianity kind of blows out of, you have to kind of deal with all of these tensions. And I think that's why theologians kind of gradually trying to come in. But given also the role that the diasporic community has really contributed to the expansion of the Christian faith, even in the context of cross-cultural diffusion, I think all of these fields are really important. My training is in theology and contextual theology, and that's what I bring to the field. So I do hope that, historians, do you write in the field? Sorry, I don't think we've met, but do you?
I regularly attend Yale Edinburgh group. So I attend Yale Edinburgh group.
Oh, the Yale Edinburgh group, okay. So, all right, okay. So we need to touch base and catch up, wow.
So we'll do one last question over here on the side, and then we'll wrap up for tonight.
Hi, hello?
Yeah.
Is it on? Oh yeah, it is. So my question is, looking at the cultural context of people, and when you're trying to bring Christianity into indigenous cultures, whether it's anywhere in the world, sort of going off of your question, when we're trying to bring Christianity and explain it, when their Christian language is so based on kingship, it's so based on messianic thought, which is so ingrained into Christian thought and Western society, that how do we translate that into terms for indigenous people that might be understood? So you were mentioning how some people might say, might look at Christ as an ancestor, because the idea of a Messiah is just so foreign. What are some ways in which, not just translators, but people overall, missionaries, are navigating those issues?
I think it is always important to there is a temptation to superimpose a foreign concept on a new culture, because that's the easy way to go about it, especially if the missionary is not trained, hasn't taken time to study the local cultures. I don't think it's effective at all. I actually think that the missionary needs the help of the local people. And Lamin Sane actually does this really well in his writings when he talks about the role that translation has played in the whole process. Because as the missionaries got involved in the translation business, it gave them the opportunity to learn about the language and the culture of their local community. And that also gave them the opportunity to know the people and treat them as people and recognize their own uniqueness and cultures as well. So if in an indigenous community, for example, depending on the particular theological issue that you want to communicate, I'm assuming that there are metaphors, idioms that are important to the way of life, the way of thinking of those communities that a missionary or a Christian pastor or a priest, we're going to have to learn, understand, and then try to explain the faith using those, because it is very effective. That, of course, for me, is the first level. A deeper level, though, and that's why I was talking about contextual theology, that you also need this particular person to also develop the skills of identifying the questions that the community is actually generating for the Christian faith and engage those questions as well. So that is always, at least that's my argument in the art of contextual theology, that the explanatory model works, but it doesn't take us quite far. We do need to develop that skills of identifying the questions that the local communities are generating for the Christian faith, and then constructively engage those questions as well. So on the one hand, explain using local metaphor, but something deeper, I hope, should come. Because it's one thing to explain who Jesus Christ to someone and say, he's like an ancestor. The person might say, okay, fine, we know, okay, this is what he does. But as they start to engage this Christ from the wells of, from their own context, they're going to have questions for this Christ. What do you do about that? That requires constructive work. And I think that that's where many of our missionaries are not equipped well. So hopefully a place like Wycliffe will be a center where we bring people and train them and get them ready to get the job done. At least I hope, Bishop Stevens, that's one of the reasons why you brought me. But
So I think Dr. Ezigbo will be here for a little bit, so if you want to chat after, he'll probably stick around for a few minutes. But I just want to thank you all for coming out tonight, especially Dr. Ezigbo for enlightening us on a lot of these topics.
Thank you.
Feel free to grab some more snacks or another drink, but thank you all for coming out. And,
Thank you for coming and spending your evening with us.